In February 2012, the quiet city of Bluefields, Nicaragua, was shaken when heavyweight boxer Evans the Sandman Quinn shot and killed Raul Bennett Sambola in a crowded restaurant, then fled by jet ski. What followed was a year-long manhunt, a confession, and the stunning fall of a local hero. Bluefields, a port city on Nicaragua's Caribbean coast, is a place of contrasts. It is lively with the rhythm of music, fishing boats crowding the harbor, and people who know each other's families across generations. But beneath its charm lies an undercurrent of tension, where disputes rarely stay private. In early 2012, this setting became the stage for a story that shocked the community and drew attention across the country. It was a story of Evans the Sandman Quinn, a man who had once been admired for his strength in the boxing ring, but whose name would soon be linked to violence, fear, and one of the most dramatic manhunts in Nicaragua's recent history. Evans Quinn was 28 years old at the time, already known as a professional heavyweight boxer. He had earned the nickname the Sandman for the way he could end fights decisively, sending opponents to the canvas with heavy blows. In Bluefields, he was more than just an athlete. He was a symbol of pride for locals who rarely saw one of their own reach international recognition. Quinn had fought in the United States and Europe, building a reputation as a man whose sheer size and power made him a natural in the sport. Yet behind the public admiration, Quinn was a young man still tied to family conflicts at home, conflicts that would eventually change his life forever. The other central figure in this tragedy was Raul Bennett Sambola. Raul, in his early 30s, was a resident of Bluefields with family connections in the community. He was not a celebrity like Quinn, but he was known locally and respected by those around him. The two men were caught in a family feud that had been simmering for some time. Tensions in Bluefields often carried a personal weight, and when disagreements became bitter, they could last for years. For Quinn and Sambola, the feud was more than just words exchanged. It carried the kind of hostility that people close to them knew could erupt at any moment. In February 2012, the long-running feud reached its breaking point. On that day, Quinn and Sambola came face to face inside a restaurant in Bluefields. Witnesses later described how the tension between them was obvious from the start. Restaurants in the city were places where people came together, but in this instance, the public setting did nothing to calm the anger. What happened next stunned everyone present. Evans Quinn, the celebrated boxer, pulled out a gun and fired at Raul Bennett Sambola. In a matter of seconds, the confrontation turned fatal. Sambola was killed instantly, leaving bystanders in shock and panic as the scene erupted into chaos. For Bluefields, a small city where news travels fast, the killing was more than just another violent act. It was an earthquake. To many, it was almost unthinkable that a man who had once represented the city on the world stage would commit such a brutal act in plain sight. Word of the shooting spread across town within hours. Families whispered about what they had heard, while the authorities rushed to secure the area and piece together what had happened. Sambola's family was left with grief that could not be measured, while Quinn had only one thought on his mind: escape. What followed was a scene as dramatic as the crime itself. Quinn did not linger after the shooting. He left the restaurant and made his way to the city's waterfront, a place he knew well. Bluefields, with its connection to the sea, provided him with a route few others could have pulled off. He mounted a jet ski and fled into the open waters. It was a getaway that felt more like a scene from an action movie than real life. For the residents who saw it, the image of a heavyweight boxer speeding away across the waves after killing a man would remain unforgettable. The police launched a search immediately, but Quinn's head start, combined with the vastness of the coastline and rivers feeding into Bluefields, gave him an advantage. A man of his stature could not easily blend into a crowd, yet in a region where family ties run deep and loyalty is often stronger than fear of the law, Quinn managed to disappear. For days, then weeks, authorities combed the area, but there were no arrests. The fugitive boxer had slipped away, leaving behind a city that could not stop talking about the murder and the brazen escape. The story quickly made headlines beyond Bluefields. National news outlets reported on the case, pointing out how a man once celebrated for his achievements in sports had turned into a wanted killer. Commentators debated how such a feud could push Quinn to violence. International boxing circles also took notice, as Quinn's name had once appeared on fight cards abroad. Now, instead of being associated with a promising career, his name was tied to a killing that cast a long shadow over his achievements. As weeks turned into months, Quinn's absence only deepened the mystery. Where had he gone? Some believed he remained hidden in the forests and coastal villages near Bluefields, using his knowledge of the area to stay one step ahead of the authorities. Others speculated he had fled the country entirely, perhaps using contacts abroad. For the police, the frustration grew. The killing of Sambala was not just a local crime. It had become a national embarrassment. A man wanted for murder had managed to escape in broad daylight and remain free, despite the government's efforts to track him down. The community of Bluefields was left to live with the fear and uncertainty. People spoke about Quinn in hushed tones, half out of anger, half out of respect for his ability to evade capture. Sambala's family, meanwhile, had no closure. They mourned a son, a brother, a man taken from them in a moment of violence that could not be undone. The image of him lying dead in that restaurant haunted those who had been there, and the knowledge that his killer was still free weighed heavily on their minds. Through it all, Quinn became both a ghost and a legend. Children whispered about seeing him slip through town at night, while adults wondered if he was hiding in plain sight. The authorities offered reassurances that they were working to bring him to justice, but as the months dragged on, their words rang hollow. A year would pass before there was any resolution, but in the early days after the crime, it felt to many as if Quinn had simply vanished into the air. The days after the killing of Raoul Bennett, Sambala turned into weeks, and Evans the Sandman Quinn seemed to vanish from Bluefields without a trace. For the authorities, it was a frustrating reality. They had expected a quick arrest, especially since everyone knew who the shooter was. Quinn had not tried to conceal his identity when he pulled the trigger inside the restaurant. Witnesses had seen him clearly, and the community knew him well. Yet despite his notoriety, he was gone. The boxer who once drew attention for his strength and skill was now the most wanted man in Nicaragua, and the search for him grew larger as the story spread. The image of Quinn speeding away on a jet ski after the shooting became symbolic of his flight from justice. It gave people something to picture, something dramatic and almost unbelievable. This was not a small-time criminal sneaking out of town. This was a heavyweight fighter, a man with size and presence, escaping across the sea. Police boats scoured the waters in the days that followed, while officers searched nearby villages and forests. But Quinn had the advantage of familiarity. He knew the coastline, he knew the rivers that cut through the dense land, and he understood how easy it was to slip away in an area where people lived scattered and close to one another. For residents of Bluefields, his disappearance became part of everyday conversation. In markets, on street corners, in family gatherings, people wondered aloud where he was. Some believed he was hiding with relatives in the region, protected by the loyalty that bound families together in tight communities. Others speculated that he had made it much farther, possibly across borders, using contacts he had formed during his years as a boxer abroad. His name carried weight, and that might have helped him find temporary safe havens. As months passed, the absence of Quinn took on an almost mythical quality. Children whispered stories about seeing him late at night, moving quietly through the outskirts of town, while adults debated whether such sightings were real or imagined. He was described alternately as a fugitive barely surviving and as a man comfortably hidden by people who supported him. For the police, every rumor became a lead to chase, but each one ended the same way: no sign of Quinn. Meanwhile, the family of Raoul Bennett Sambala was left to grieve with no closure. The shooting had taken their son and brother, and the fact that his killer remained free was a wound that did not heal. They spoke openly about their frustration, urging the government to act and criticizing the police for their failure to bring Quinn in. The community sympathized with them, but sympathy did not erase the reality that justice had not been served. Authorities in Managua, the nation's capital, began to feel the weight of the case as well. The murder was no longer a local issue. It had become a national embarrassment that a man who had killed in plain sight could avoid arrest for so long. Reports surfaced in newspapers across Nicaragua, with headlines questioning the competence of the police and the seriousness of the government's efforts. Each article added pressure, and each unanswered question deepened the sense of failure. Still, Quinn remained elusive. His size made him hard to miss, but his determination to avoid capture kept him one step ahead. He had lived a life of discipline as an athlete, and that discipline now helped him as a fugitive. He knew how to endure discomfort, how to control his movements, and how to disappear into places where outsiders would struggle. For over a year, this ability to stay hidden made him untouchable, and for some, it even gave him an air of dark admiration. But the admiration was not universal. Many people in Bluefields felt anger toward him, not only for killing Sambala, but also for betraying the community's pride. Evans Quinn had been someone they looked up to. His career in the ring had given them something to boast about, a fighter from their own city competing on international stages. By choosing violence and by running from a law, he had destroyed that pride. Instead of being remembered for victories in boxing, he was remembered for a killing that cast a shadow over everyone connected to him. The search for Quinn also revealed the challenges of policing in regions like Bluefields. The Caribbean coast was distant from Managua, and resources were thin. Roads were limited, the coastline stretched far, and communities were spread across areas where communication was slow. These difficulties played into Quinn's favor. He had grown up in this environment, and he knew how to navigate it better than the officers sent to find him. Each failed attempt at capture seemed to highlight the gap between local knowledge and outside enforcement. As the months dragged on, Quinn's story also began to take on an international dimension. Because he had once fought in the United States and Europe, newspapers abroad picked up pieces of the case. To readers outside Nicaragua, it was almost surreal. A professional boxer, once with prospects of making a career in sports, now a fugitive wanted for murder. Articles compared his downfall to other athletes who had lost everything because of personal choices. But Quinn's story stood out for its mix of violence and dramatic escape. For Bluefields, however, it was less about international headlines and more about daily life under the weight of his absence. The fear that he might resurface unexpectedly, the frustration that justice was still missing, and the curiosity about where he was became part of the city's atmosphere. People learned to live with the uncertainty, but the case never faded far from conversation. Behind the scenes, law enforcement continued to work. They gathered intelligence, pressed contacts, and tried to track any movement Quinn might have made. Yet each step forward was slow, and the trail often went cold. The authorities faced not just a fugitive, but a community network where silence and loyalty made their work nearly impossible. To capture Quinn, they needed time, patience, and, eventually, a stroke of luck. For Quinn himself, life as a fugitive must have been a sharp contrast to the life he once knew. He had gone from the structured world of training camps, gyms, and fight nights to the uncertainty of hiding and moving in secrecy. He no longer had crowds cheering him on or opponents to defeat. Instead, he had only the constant pressure of avoiding capture and the knowledge that his name was being spoken daily as that of a wanted man. The longer he remained at large, the more it seemed like he might never be caught. Stories of fugitives surviving for years without being found were not unheard of, and some in Bluefields even began to doubt whether he would ever face trial. For Sambala's family, this was the hardest part. They had already lost their loved one, and the thought that the man responsible could live freely while they carried their grief felt like a cruel twist of fate. But despite the doubts and the delays, authorities did not stop. They continued to look for openings, continued to press forward with their investigation, and continued to remind the public that Quinn was still a wanted man. Slowly, the network that supported him began to weaken. People grew tired of hiding him. The longer he stayed in the shadows, the harder it became to remain invisible. By the time a year had passed since the killing of Raul Bennett Sambala, the story of Evans the Sandman, Quinn, had grown into one of Nicaragua's most notorious cases. A former heavyweight boxer, once celebrated for carrying the pride of Bluefields into international boxing rings, was now remembered not for victories, but for violence, a manhunt, and the silence of his disappearance. The longer he remained out of reach, the more restless the public became. For the authorities, the failure to capture him threatened their credibility. For the victim's family, every day without justice was a renewed wound. Something had to give, and eventually it did. The collapse of Quinn's freedom did not happen suddenly. It was the result of slow, relentless pressure from investigators, combined with the natural difficulties of living as a fugitive. For over a year, he had relied on loyalty from people around him, on family ties, and on the geography of Nicaragua's Caribbean coast. But loyalty frays when danger lingers too long. Those who had once protected him began to feel the strain of being connected to a wanted man. The longer Quinn stayed hidden, the more attention anyone close to him received from police. Eventually, the cracks in his support network widened enough for authorities to take advantage. When police finally located Quinn, the news spread quickly. The arrest ended one of the most embarrassing chases in recent memory. For Bluefields, there was relief mixed with disbelief. After so long, the fugitive boxer had been caught. Residents who had once speculated about sightings of him now learned that he had not gone very far. He had stayed within reach, relying on local knowledge to keep out of sight, but in the end, it was not enough. The arrest brought with it a sense of inevitability. Quinn was no ordinary criminal. Everyone in Nicaragua knew who he was. From the moment of his capture, he drew attention, both for his past as a fighter and for his actions as a fugitive. News outlets covered every detail, describing the end of his run as the conclusion to a chapter that had humiliated police and saddened a community. For the family of Raul Bennett Sambola, the moment carried the weight of long-awaited justice. They could finally hope for answers, for accountability, and for a resolution to the case that had defined their grief. Once in custody, Quinn faced the reality of what he had done. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses had seen him shoot Sambola in the restaurant, and his disappearance for over a year was as clear an admission of guilt as any confession. Under questioning, he admitted to the crime. His words confirmed what everyone already knew. He had killed Raul Bennett Sambola during a confrontation fueled by a bitter family feud. The confession was stark, without embellishment. It did not change the outcome for the victim's family, but it removed any remaining doubt about his responsibility. The trial process that followed was less about proving guilt and more about formally recognizing it. Quinn's confession left little room for a long or complicated case. Still, the proceedings mattered. They gave Sambola's family the opportunity to see justice carried out in a courtroom, to watch the man who had taken their loved one's life held accountable by the law. For Bluefields, the trial also served as closure. It was the moment when speculation ended and truth was laid bare. When sentencing came, the court delivered a punishment intended to reflect both the seriousness of the crime and the need for justice after such a dramatic escape. Evans the Sandman Quinn was sentenced to 17 years in La Modelo prison, one of Nicaragua's largest and most notorious facilities. The sentence marked the final fall of a man who had once represented hope for his community. From professional boxing matches abroad to a prison cell at home, his journey illustrated how quickly success can collapse under the weight of violence and pride. La Modelo prison, located outside Managua, was far removed from the life Quinn had once known. For a man who had spent years training, fighting, and traveling, the walls of the prison would become a new reality, one defined not by victory, but by routine and confinement. For Sambola's family, the sentence brought some measure of relief. It did not undo their loss, but it showed that the justice system had not forgotten them. Their son and brother had been killed, and though nothing could bring him back, the man responsible would spend years behind bars. The case of Evans Quinn remains a story told in Bluefields with a mix of sadness and disbelief. For many, the memory of his boxing career is overshadowed completely by the killing. Where once people might have spoken of his fights and his nickname, the Sandman, they now recall the restaurant shooting, the escape by jet ski, and the long months of evasion. The story became less about sport and more about what happens when anger and family disputes spiral into violence. The turning point in the case was not just the arrest, but the way the community processed what had happened. In Bluefields, pride in Quinn had once been strong. He was proof that someone from their city could step onto an international stage. After the murder, that pride turned into disappointment. Instead of being a figure to look up to, he became an example of wasted potential. The community learned that admiration could be shattered in a single violent act, and that reputation, no matter how strong, could not protect someone from the law forever. For Quinn, the years ahead would be defined not by titles or victories, but by time served in prison. His name would remain known, but not for the reasons he once hoped. His legacy, shaped by choices he made in a moment of rage, became a cautionary tale. Talent, discipline, and fame could not outweigh the reality of pulling a trigger in a crowded restaurant. His story serves as a reminder of how deeply personal conflicts can unravel lives when left unresolved. The final chapter of this case is not only about crime and punishment, but also about theme. At its core, the story of Evans Quinn is about downfall. It is about how a man with promise allowed anger and vengeance to override reason, destroying not only his own future, but also the life of another. It is about how family feuds, when left unchecked, can spill into the public and end in tragedy. And it is about how justice, though delayed, can still arrive, even after long months of fear and frustration. In Bluefields, people still talk about that day in 2012, about the sound of gunfire in a restaurant, about the jet ski racing into the distance, and about the long wait for resolution. They speak of Raul Bennett Sambala, the man whose life was taken too soon, and they speak of Evans the Sandman Quinn, the fighter who lost everything when he chose violence. The case left scars on the community, but it also left lessons. In the end, it showed that no matter how far someone runs, justice can catch up. The story of Evans Quinn closes with a sense of finality. A once promising athlete, admired for his power and skill, will spend years behind prison walls. A family, though still grieving, saw accountability delivered. And a city, once proud of its fighter, now remembers him for the crime that changed everything. It is a story that begins with pride, turns to violence, stretches into a year of mystery, and ends with justice. It is a true crime story that will not be forgotten in Nicaragua, a story that lives on as both a warning and a reminder of how one choice can define a life. In 2005, a single punch inside an English bar turned an ordinary night into a tragedy. A bouncer, a customer, and a fatal uppercut that shocked a community. This is the story of how one violent moment ended a life and changed another forever. On a cold night in England in late 2005, the ordinary rhythm of a local bar shifted into something that would later be described in newspapers as a shocking and senseless act of violence. The case would go on to be remembered as the uppercut murder, and at the center of it all were two men whose paths might never have crossed otherwise. One was working that night, trying to keep order in a busy venue. The other was there simply to enjoy a night out. Their encounter lasted only moments, but its consequences were permanent. Gary Delaney, a man in his late 20s, was employed as a bouncer at the bar. He was not a stranger to confrontation. Like many who work security at night spots, he had dealt with unruly customers before, people who had too much to drink, arguments that flared between strangers, or tempers that ran too high as the night wore on. The job required a balance of firmness and restraint, keeping order without crossing the line into unnecessary violence. On most nights, that balance was maintained. But on this night, something went terribly wrong. Among the customers inside was Paul Price, a man in his early 30s. Unlike Delaney, he was not there to work, nor did he expect trouble. He was simply another face in the crowd, another customer seeking entertainment in a familiar setting. Price's age placed him among many others who frequented such places. Young enough to enjoy the nightlife, old enough to feel comfortable in a bar where things could get loud, crowded, and unpredictable. As the night progressed, the atmosphere inside the bar shifted. Accounts from witnesses later painted a picture of growing tension. It was the kind of tension that often goes unnoticed until it explodes into something much more serious. Some recalled raised voices, others saw pushing and shoving, but all agreed that a confrontation began to build between Price and Delaney. What started the clash was less clear. Some suggested it was a heated exchange of words. Others believed alcohol had fueled emotions on one side or the other. Whatever the reason, the focus of the crowd soon turned toward the escalating dispute between the customer and the bouncer. Delaney's role, as the man charged with maintaining order, was to handle the situation. For most in his line of work, that meant calming the customer down, guiding them toward the exit, and avoiding unnecessary force. But on this occasion, the confrontation took a sudden and violent turn. In the middle of the bar, with people watching, Delaney struck Paul Price with a single, powerful uppercut punch. Witnesses later described the blow as sharp, sudden, and devastating. It was not the kind of push or shove that might be expected in a bar dispute. It was a direct and forceful strike, delivered with the kind of strength that can only come from someone used to physical exertion and fighting. The punch lifted Price from his balance and sent him crashing backwards. The bar, filled with the usual noise of music, conversation, and laughter, fell silent for a moment as people realized what had just happened. Price's body hit the hard floor, and his head struck with a sickening impact. That sound, many remembered, was unforgettable. The fall fractured his skull, causing an injury that would later prove fatal. In that instant, the entire atmosphere changed. What had been a typical night in a local bar became a crime scene. Price lay motionless on the ground. People rushed to his side, some in shock, others scrambling for help. The staff, the customers, and Delaney himself were now caught in a situation that was spiraling far beyond a simple barroom scuffle. The decision to throw that punch had turned a heated argument into a matter of life and death. Medical help was called quickly, and Price was rushed to the hospital. Doctors did what they could, but the injury was too severe. The force of the punch and the resulting fall had caused irreparable damage. Price never recovered. His death turned what might have been a charge of assault into a charge of murder. For Delaney, the weight of his decision that night was only beginning to unfold. What may have seemed in the moment like an act of control or dominance now carried the full gravity of the law. A man had died, and the responsibility rested squarely on the bouncer who delivered the blow. The community around the bar was left in shock. People who had known Price as a regular customer struggled to understand how a night out could end so suddenly in tragedy. Those who knew Delaney questioned how a man entrusted with security could cross the line in such a reckless way. The story spread quickly, capturing the attention of local media, who dubbed it the uppercut murder, a phrase that summed up both the action and its grim outcome. The early days after the incident were filled with grief for Price's family and friends, who were forced to come to terms with a loss that felt senseless. For them, Paul Price was more than a name in the headlines. He was a son, a friend, perhaps a partner or father, and his life had been cut short in a way that could never be undone. Their pain was compounded by the fact that the fatal blow had come not from a random stranger in the street, but from someone in a position of authority at the bar, a man who should have been protecting customers, not harming them. Meanwhile, law enforcement began their investigation. Witness statements were collected, medical evidence was documented, and the sequence of events was pieced together. It was clear from the outset that Delaney had struck Price, and that the blow had caused the fall leading to his death. What remained for the courts to decide was intent, responsibility, and the appropriate punishment. But that would come later. In the immediate aftermath, what mattered most was that a man had lost his life, another man was facing charges that would alter his own future forever, and an entire community was left grappling with the consequences of a violent moment that no one could take back. The night of the incident would linger in memory for everyone present. The music that stopped, the crowd that froze, the thud of a body hitting the ground, all of it would remain etched in the minds of those who had been inside that bar. For them, it was not just a headline. It was something they had lived through, something they had seen unfold before their eyes, and something that would haunt them long after the case left the courtroom. In the days after Paul Price's death, the shock that rippled through the community settled into a heavy sense of grief and disbelief. People who knew him spoke quietly about the kind of man he was, and how strange it felt that someone so familiar could be gone in such an abrupt and violent way. His friends remembered him as a man in his early 30s who enjoyed nights out, who worked hard during the day, and who carried no reputation for violence. He had been an ordinary customer on an ordinary night, and his sudden death underscored how fragile and unpredictable life could be when anger and force cross paths. For Price's family, the days became unbearable. Losing a loved one is always painful, but losing him in circumstances that felt unnecessary added another layer of devastation. The fact that his life had ended not through illness or accident, but through a single punch in a bar was difficult for them to accept. They struggled with questions that had no answers. Why had the altercation escalated? Why had violence become the response? And why did Paul Price not make it home that night? These questions hung over them as they prepared for a funeral that should never have needed to take place. At the same time, attention began to shift toward Gary Delaney, the man in his late 20s who had thrown the punch. As a bouncer, he was part of the fabric of nightlife, someone the public often saw but rarely thought much about. Bouncers were supposed to keep order, to step in when fights threatened to erupt, and to make sure patrons left when they became too disruptive. The public expectation was clear. They had authority, but that authority came with responsibility. Delaney's actions that night placed him under scrutiny not only as an individual, but also as a representative of those whose job was to provide safety. Police wasted little time gathering evidence. Witnesses from inside the bar were interviewed, each providing their account of how the events had unfolded. Many agreed that there had been an argument, that tempers flared, and that Delaney had reacted with more force than was necessary. Several described the uppercut in vivid detail, recalling how quickly it happened and how shocking it was to see Price collapse to the ground. Their testimonies painted a consistent picture. This was not a push, not an attempt to restrain, but a deliberate and forceful punch. The medical reports only confirmed what the witnesses had already described. Price's injuries were not minor. The fall had caused a severe skull fracture, leading to swelling and bleeding in the brain. Doctors had tried, but there was no way to save him. The connection between the punch, the fall, and the fatal injury was undeniable. As the case gained attention, the public conversation broadened. News outlets began to report on what they were now calling the uppercut murder. The phrase, though stark, captured the essence of what had happened. It was not a stabbing or a shooting. It was not a prolonged attack. It was a single punch, an uppercut that ended a man's life. The simplicity of the act made it all the more disturbing. People began to ask whether too much power was sometimes placed in the hands of bouncers, and whether better training or oversight might prevent tragedies like this. In pubs, workplaces, and homes across the area, conversations turned again and again to the case. Some argued that Delaney had simply lost control in a heated moment, while others insisted that as a professional bouncer, he should have known better than to respond with violence. The fact that Price had been unarmed and had posed no real threat beyond a verbal confrontation made the attack seem all the more excessive. While this public debate continued, the investigation moved forward with quiet determination. Police compiled their evidence and built a case that would eventually stand before a jury. Delaney was arrested and questioned. The man who had once stood at the entrance of bars, deciding who could come in and who should leave, now found himself behind locked doors, waiting for the justice system to decide his future. For those who had been inside the bar that night, the memory lingered. Many spoke about the eerie silence that followed the punch, the way people froze, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Some said they could not forget the sound of Price's head striking the floor. Others recalled the frantic attempts to help him, the confusion as paramedics arrived, and the grim realization that this was not going to be something he could simply recover from. Those moments replayed in their minds, a loop of shock and regret they could not escape. In the weeks that followed, Price's absence became more pronounced. His family continued to grieve, facing the reality that their lives would never be the same. Friends struggled with the emptiness left behind, missing the man who had been part of their everyday routines. The bar where it all happened became a place marked by memory, no longer just another spot for nightlife, but a reminder of the violence that had unfolded there. Delaney's own circle of acquaintances and family were also thrown into turmoil. For them, the story was not simply one of a stranger committing a crime. It was about someone they knew, someone they had spoken with, someone they never imagined would be accused of murder. They wrestled with their own feelings, torn between loyalty to Delaney and the undeniable reality of what had occurred. As the legal process slowly gathered momentum, both families faced the prospect of a trial that would expose every detail of that night. The prosecution prepared to argue that Delaney had acted recklessly and with disregard for human life. The defense, on the other hand, was expected to argue that he had been provoked, that the punch was not meant to kill, and that it was a tragic accident rather than deliberate violence. These competing narratives would soon be laid out in front of a jury, but for now, the case remained a weight on the shoulders of everyone involved. Outside the courtroom, the public kept talking. Stories like this struck a chord because they felt both shocking and ordinary. Everyone understood bar arguments. Everyone had seen tempers flare on a night out. But not everyone had seen those arguments end in death. The idea that one punch could kill was something that unsettled people, reminding them that violence, even in small doses, carried consequences that could not be undone. The lead-up to the trial dragged on, as trials often do, with delays, preparations, and the slow march of the justice system. For those who wanted closure, it was a painful wait. For those who feared the outcome, it was a constant source of anxiety. In the background, the label "uppercut murder" stuck, repeated in newspapers and broadcasts, until it became the shorthand for everything that had happened. As months passed, the case of Gary Delaney and Paul Price moved from being a local tragedy to a symbol of something larger. The dangers of unchecked anger, the responsibilities that come with authority, and the irreversible damage that can result from a single violent act. The ordinary lives of two men had collided, and the result was a crime that would demand answers in the most public of settings. For now, though, those answers had not yet come. The confession, the conviction, and the sentencing still lay ahead. But the weight of what had already happened, the death of Paul Price, the arrest of Gary Delaney, and the grief of families left in limbo, was more than enough to show how far-reaching the consequences of that one night truly were. When the trial finally opened in 2006, it brought with it a mix of expectation, tension, and a heavy sense of loss that hung over every corner of the courtroom. On one side sat the grieving family of Paul Price, still struggling to come to terms with the fact that a man in his early 30s had been taken from them in the most sudden and violent way. On the other side sat the family of Gary Delaney, a man in his late 20s whose single act had altered the course of so many lives. Between them, a jury was tasked with making sense of what had happened in that bar on that night in late 2005. The courtroom atmosphere was described as somber. Witness after witness took the stand, recounting the events of the evening. Many had been customers in the bar, there for drinks, music, and conversation. Instead, they had found themselves watching a confrontation unfold between a bouncer and a patron, a confrontation that escalated beyond anyone's expectations. Their testimonies carried the weight of first-hand memory. They recalled the argument, the sudden blow, and the terrifying moment when Price's head struck the floor. Some admitted they froze, others described rushing to help, but all of them confirmed what investigators had already established. The punch was swift, powerful, and it left Paul Price fatally injured. The medical evidence was laid out with clinical detail. Doctors explained the nature of the skull fracture, the internal bleeding, and the injuries to the brain. They made it clear that the fall, caused by the force of Delaney's punch, was the direct cause of death. It was not speculation, not a possibility. It was fact. Price had died because of that blow, and nothing could undo it. The prosecution leaned heavily on the idea of responsibility. Delaney, they argued, had not been an ordinary customer. He was a bouncer, someone whose very role was to prevent violence, not to create it. The punch, they said, was unnecessary and reckless. Even if words had been exchanged, even if tempers had flared, nothing justified a strike so forceful that it carried the risk of serious harm. They emphasized that Price had been unarmed, that there was no imminent danger requiring such violence, and that Delaney's choice crossed the line from self-defense or control into an act of aggression that cost a man his life. The defense tried to soften the picture. They acknowledged that the punch had been thrown, but argued that it was not intended to kill. Delaney, they said, had reacted in the heat of the moment, provoked by Price during a tense exchange. They suggested it had been a split-second decision, the kind that comes when adrenaline is high and words are exchanged too quickly to allow calm thought. To them, this was not murder, but a tragic accident, a death caused by a single blow that had unintended, devastating consequences. For the jury, the task was to decide whether the weight of evidence showed more than recklessness. They listened, they took notes, and they absorbed the emotional testimonies from both sides. They heard from Price's family, who spoke of their loss, of birthdays that would never be celebrated, and of the cruel suddenness of losing a man they loved. They heard from Delaney's supporters, who struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the image of someone capable of killing with one punch. The turning point in the trial came when the sequence of events was laid out side by side. The argument, the punch, the fall, and the medical evidence that tied the injuries directly to Delaney's action. The chain was unbroken. Even if the punch had not been intended to kill, it had been intended to harm, and the harm had been severe enough to cause death. Intent in the eyes of the law could be measured not only by what a person claimed they wanted, but also by what a reasonable person could foresee from their actions. As the trial drew to its close, the jury retired to deliberate. Families waited, knowing that the decision would bring closure for some and heartbreak for others. After hours of discussion, the jury returned. The verdict was clear. Gary Delaney was guilty of murder. The courtroom was heavy with emotion as the decision was read. For Price's family, the word guilty did not bring him back, but it did bring a sense that justice had been served, that the system had recognized the seriousness of what had been done. For Delaney and his family, the verdict confirmed their worst fears. The man who had once stood outside bars to keep order would now face years behind prison walls. The sentencing came shortly after. The judge, weighing both the gravity of the act and the arguments presented, handed down a sentence of life imprisonment with a minimum term of 11 years before parole could even be considered. The reasoning was clear. As a bouncer, Delaney had a duty to restrain himself, a duty to de-escalate rather than escalate. By failing in that duty, and by delivering a punch that was both unnecessary and fatal, he had forfeited his freedom. The words of the judge carried weight. They underscored that the role of authority figures, even in places as ordinary as bars, comes with responsibility, and that stepping beyond the boundaries of that responsibility has consequences. The sentence reflected not just the death of Paul Price, but also the betrayal of the trust placed in someone who had been expected to protect, not harm. Outside the courtroom, reactions were mixed. Some saw the verdict as a warning to others in similar roles, a reminder that violence carries consequences that cannot be brushed aside as accidents. Others viewed it as a tragic waste, 2 lives destroyed in different ways by a single act of violence. Conversations continued in pubs and workplaces, with people debating whether the sentence was too harsh, too lenient, or just right. But whatever their views, no one could deny the devastation the case had brought. For Price's family, the grief did not end with the trial. They still faced the empty spaces in their lives, the milestones he would never reach, and the everyday absence of his presence. Justice had been done, but it did not erase their pain. For Delaney, prison became his new reality, a constant reminder of the night when a single decision had cost him his freedom and cost another man his life. The case of Gary Delaney and Paul Price became a lasting reminder of the dangers of unchecked anger and the responsibilities that come with power. It showed how fragile life can be, how quickly an argument can turn fatal, and how one moment of violence can ripple outward, leaving families, friends, and entire communities to carry the consequences. In the end, The uppercut murder was more than a headline. It was a story of two men whose lives collided in a moment of conflict, with results that neither could have imagined. It was a story of a family mourning, of a man imprisoned, and of a community left to reflect on how easily ordinary nights can turn into tragedies. The trial, the conviction, and the sentence brought the legal chapter to a close, but the impact of that night in 2005 would never truly fade. In a quiet Georgia town, a respected doctor was found dead in her own bedroom, her infant son standing nearby. At first glance, it looked like suicide. But the blood, the angle of the shot, and her husband's past revealed something far darker. A brutal story of betrayal and murder. In the quiet town of Leesburg, Georgia, a community built on Southern traditions and small-town rhythms, few could have imagined that one of the most shocking cases of domestic violence and murder would soon unfold. At the center of it all were two people whose lives seemed worlds apart, but had collided in a marriage that quickly spiraled into tragedy. Yathomas Riley was a man once known for his fists. A professional boxer by trade, his career had earned him the nickname Terrible Thomas the Punisher. Inside the ring, he had power, discipline, and notoriety. Outside of it, however, his reputation was far less defined. By the mid-2010s, his boxing career had faded. The glamour of lights and cheers was replaced with the quieter life of a man in his 30s, a husband and father trying to carve out stability. But behind closed doors, what was supposed to be a family home was a place of tension, conflict, and mistrust. His wife, Dr. Lisa Marie Riley, was in many ways his opposite. She was 34, respected in her profession, and dedicated to her work as an emergency room physician at Phoebe Putney Memorial Hospital in Albany. Colleagues described her as compassionate, sharp, and hardworking. She had built her career on caring for others, working long shifts in an environment that constantly demanded calm under pressure. At home, she was a mother to their infant son GWR and tried to hold her household together despite the growing instability in her marriage. The couple lived in Leesburg, a part of Lee County, where families were known to value community and faith. To neighbors and acquaintances, their lives might have seemed ordinary. A young family in a quiet town, raising a baby, living in a modern home. But inside that home, tensions had been building for some time. On June 14, 2015, a critical moment revealed just how volatile things had become. That night, Dr. Riley placed a frantic 911 call. She told authorities that her husband had pointed a gun at her, wrapped his legs around her neck and chest, and accused her of being unfaithful. When deputies arrived, they found her visibly shaken. The marks on her body reflected the struggle she described. It was not the image of a controlled athlete or a loving husband. It was something darker, a warning sign of what was to come. Yathomas Riley was arrested that night. He was charged with aggravated assault and simple battery. For Dr. Riley, the decision to call law enforcement may have been both necessary and terrifying. Domestic disputes often left women in positions of fear and uncertainty, unsure of whether seeking help might provoke further danger. For a respected physician, a woman who spent her career saving others, making that call was not easy. Yet she made it, placing her safety and her child's safety above appearances. After the arrest, Yathomas posted bond. He was released, but the incident became an official record of the violence within their home. As part of his release, he was ordered not to possess firearms. For many, this would have been a wake-up call, a turning point to seek counseling or change. But for Yathomas, it appeared to deepen a pattern of anger and control. Weeks passed, and to the outside world, life carried on. Dr. Riley continued her demanding shifts at the hospital. Yathomas remained in the household, his presence looming over a marriage already fractured by accusations and violence. Their infant son, unaware of the turmoil around him, became a silent witness to the disintegration of his family. The summer of 2015 in Georgia was hot, with a kind of sweltering evenings where air hung thick and heavy. On July 9th, just a few weeks after that domestic violence incident, surveillance footage captured movements that would later become critical in the investigation. At around 8 p.m., cameras showed Yathomas entering the family's home. Minutes later, Dr. Riley arrived, carrying their baby. She walked through the door as any mother would, holding her child and stepping into what should have been the safety of her own home. What happened in those next minutes is not fully captured on video, but the evidence left behind tells a haunting story. Around 8:16 p.m., Dr. Riley appeared heading toward the bedroom area of the home. Roughly 15 minutes later, Yathomas was seen leaving the house. His white V-neck t-shirt was spattered with blood. He walked out quickly, without his wife, and without explaining to anyone what had happened inside. Later that night, the home's ADT security system recorded suspicious activity. The account tied to Yathomas repeatedly accessed the system remotely. Data logs showed multiple logins, as if he was checking or manipulating the home's security monitoring from afar. Around that same time, the master bedroom's glass break sensor was triggered. These details, invisible in the moment, would later prove crucial as investigators pieced together the truth. Inside the home, tragedy had already unfolded. By the following morning, July 10th, emergency services were called. When paramedics arrived, they found a scene that was both heartbreaking and deeply disturbing. Dr. Lisa Riley was discovered in the master bedroom, lifeless. She was already in rigor mortis, meaning she had been dead for hours. Near her body lay a handgun. Blood was everywhere, splattered across furniture, staining clothing, even touching items meant for the baby. Yet the infant himself, standing nearby in nothing but a diaper, was unharmed and free of blood. He had spent the night alone in that room, close to the body of his mother. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like a suicide. A gun near the body, a wound on the head. No eyewitnesses. Yathomas would later claim that his wife had shot herself. But to investigators, the details told a different story. The trajectory of the bullet wound was steep and downward, entering at the right side of Dr. Riley's forehead and exiting behind her left ear. The angle was inconsistent with a self-inflicted shot. It was not a contact wound, meaning the gun had not been pressed against her skin, as is common in suicides. Instead, it suggested someone else had pulled the trigger. Adding to the suspicion was the blood spatter pattern. The stains on Yathomas Riley's shirt were not random. Forensic experts determined that he had been extremely close when the shot was fired, close enough for blood spray to coat his clothing. His decision to leave the house with that shirt on, rather than change or hide it, showed both recklessness and confidence that he could control the narrative. Neighbors and friends would later recall how unexpected the news was. For some, it was difficult to reconcile the image of a respected physician being killed in her own home, allegedly at the hands of her husband. For others who knew more of the family's struggles, the events felt like the terrifying culmination of a cycle of control and abuse. As investigators began piecing together the evidence, a clearer picture emerged. The June 14th domestic incident had not been an isolated outburst. It had been a warning. The accusations of infidelity, the physical assault, the gun, all pointed to a man consumed by suspicion and rage. The July 9th shooting was the ultimate act of violence, silencing a wife who had dared to call for help just weeks earlier. The story of Yathomas and Lisa Riley, in those weeks of summer 2015, became one of escalating violence that moved swiftly from threat to murder. It was a case that shocked Lee County and spread quickly through Georgia's headlines. How could a doctor dedicated to saving lives end up dead in her own home? How could a man once celebrated in the boxing ring become the central figure in a murder investigation? As the hours after Lisa Riley's death turned into days, the weight of evidence against Yathomas began to grow. The blood on his shirt, the security system logs, the trajectory of the gunshot wound, and the testimony about his violent behavior weeks earlier all painted a damning picture. Still, the official process of charging and trying him for the crime would take time. The wheels of justice were beginning to turn, and the tragic story of Lisa Riley was only entering its next chapter. The death of Dr. Lisa Marie Riley immediately drew attention from local authorities. The scene inside the Leesburg home was chaotic, but investigators quickly began sorting through the evidence with a disciplined approach. At first glance, the presence of the handgun near her body might have suggested suicide, but experienced officers recognized details that pointed in another direction. The body position, the trajectory of the bullet, the absence of a contact wound, and the blood patterns all raised immediate red flags. Investigators began with the most obvious detail: Yathomas Riley's presence and behavior before and after the shooting. Surveillance cameras had captured him entering the home on the night of July 9th and leaving shortly after, his shirt spattered with blood. This was not circumstantial evidence. It was visual proof of his proximity at the critical time. Furthermore, the shirt itself was collected and tested, with forensic specialists confirming that the blood belonged to Dr. Riley. This finding placed Yathomas at the scene of the fatal shot and in close range of his wife's body when she died. The home's ADT security system became another key piece of evidence. Records showed that Yathomas accessed the system multiple times that night after leaving the house. His logins were not casual check-ins. He appeared to be monitoring and adjusting the system remotely, activity that suggested a man trying to control or conceal what had happened inside the house. Particularly troubling was the log that revealed a glass break sensor had gone off in the master bedroom while he was still in the house. Investigators considered this detail carefully. The sensor indicated physical disturbance, consistent with the moment of the shooting or the aftermath of violence. The autopsy report added further clarity. The medical examiner determined that the trajectory of the bullet made suicide highly improbable. The bullet had entered at an angle from the right side of Lisa's forehead and exited behind her left ear. The downward path of the shot indicated someone else had pulled the trigger while standing above her. The lack of soot or stippling around the wound reinforced that it was not a close contact shot, undermining the claim that she had pressed the gun against her own head. Instead, it suggested distance and intent, the mark of homicide rather than self-inflicted death. At the same time, the infant child became a heartbreaking element of the case. The baby was found alive in the same room where his mother's body lay, dressed only in a diaper. He had no blood on him, though baby clothes and nearby items were stained with spatter. Investigators and prosecutors later highlighted this detail to underscore the cruelty of the situation. Not only had Lisa Riley been killed in her own home, but her child had been left overnight in the presence of her body. This fact would weigh heavily when charges were drafted. Law enforcement also looked back to the events of June 14th, less than a month earlier, when Lisa had called 911. That night, she had reported that Yathomas pointed a gun at her and physically restrained her, wrapping his legs around her chest and neck. Deputies had documented her distress and the marks on her body. Though he was arrested and released on bond, the incident became powerful evidence of a pattern of violence. Prosecutors would later use it to establish a history of abuse and to demonstrate intent in July. As the evidence piled up, investigators prepared their case for the district attorney. On August 26, 2015, a grand jury in Lee County indicted Yathomas Riley. The charges were extensive: malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault against his wife, aggravated assault against his infant son, and cruelty to children. Each charge reflected a part of the tragedy: Lisa's death, the violent context, and the exposure of their baby to the crime scene. The case moved into the court system, drawing significant attention across Georgia. To many, it was shocking that a respected physician, someone known for saving lives in the emergency room, could be killed so brutally. To others, the involvement of a former professional boxer added a layer of notoriety. Media outlets highlighted the contrast between Yathomas's past in the ring and his alleged role in his wife's death. This was not just a local case. It became a story followed on regional and national platforms. As pre-trial motions and hearings took place, Yathomas maintained his innocence. He insisted that his wife had shot herself. His defense team floated theories suggesting suicide, pointing to stressors in her life and the fact that the gun was found beside her. They tried to challenge the forensic evidence, arguing that the conclusions about trajectory and distance were not definitive. But prosecutors countered with the overwhelming physical and digital trail. the security system logs, the blood patterns, the prior assault, and the autopsy findings. The cruelty to children charge was another critical part of the prosecution's narrative. The state emphasized that the infant GWR had been left in that blood-smeared room through the night. Prosecutors argued that no matter what version of events one believed, the child's exposure to such horror was an undeniable act of cruelty. This charge, layered onto the murder counts, amplified the seriousness of the case and the picture of a man who showed no regard for his child's well-being. By the time the trial date approached in 2016, the evidence against Yathomas Riley had grown into a damning collection of forensic details, digital records, and witness accounts. The prosecution prepared to present a timeline beginning with the June domestic assault, leading to the night of July 9th, and ending with the discovery of Lisa's body on July 10th. The story they were building was clear. This was not an impulsive act, but the culmination of escalating violence. Forensic testimony was expected to play a central role. Experts would explain the science of blood spatter, the impossibility of suicide given the wound trajectory, and the meaning of the ADT logs that traced Yathomas' actions. Police officers and deputies from the June 14th call would testify about Lisa's fear and the visible evidence of abuse. Friends, family, and medical colleagues of Lisa Riley would provide insight into her life and character, showing that she was not a woman on the verge of taking her own life, but someone building her career and raising her son. Meanwhile, the defense prepared to focus on doubt. They aimed to exploit any ambiguity in forensic testimony and to argue that suicide could not be ruled out entirely. Yathomas, once celebrated for his strength, now stood accused of using that same strength in the most destructive way. As the courtroom prepared for trial, the contrast between the public image of the couple and the violent reality inside their home would be laid bare. For the people of Leesburg, and for those who followed the case, the trial promised to reveal more about what had happened behind the walls of the Riley home. It would also force the community to confront the broader issue of domestic violence, and how even respected, successful individuals were not immune to its reach. When the trial finally began, it was clear that every detail would matter. Jurors would hear about the night of June 14th, the evening of July 9th, the ADT system records, the bloody T-shirt, and the downward trajectory of a bullet that could not have been self-inflicted. They would see images of the crime scene, hear from experts, and listen to the 911 calls that revealed the fear in Lisa's voice just weeks before her death. This was no longer a story about a boxer and a doctor. It was a story of a woman whose life ended violently in her own bedroom, of a child left alone in the aftermath, and of a man who claimed innocence in the face of mounting evidence. The trial would decide whether Yathomas Riley's version of events could withstand the weight of the state's case. And as the jury listened, the story of the Riley family continued to unfold in stark, devastating detail. The trial of Yathomas Riley unfolded in Lee County in 2016 with the weight of an entire community watching. For months, the case had been building momentum, and by the time it reached the courtroom, the evidence formed a devastating chain of events. The prosecution opened with a clear narrative. A respected emergency room doctor, a mother, and a woman with a promising future had been taken from her family, and the man responsible was her husband, a former professional boxer who had turned his suspicion and anger into fatal violence. Jurors listened to the testimony of deputies who had responded to the June 14th call. They recalled Lisa Riley's visible distress that night, her trembling voice, and the marks on her body. They described the scene where she reported that her husband had pointed a gun at her and wrapped his legs around her neck and chest. That moment, just weeks before her death, became a powerful example of the danger she lived under, and a warning that had tragically gone unheeded. The prosecution emphasized this as a precursor to murder, evidence that the July killing was not an accident or an act of despair, but the culmination of escalating domestic abuse. Forensic experts took the stand to explain the science behind the blood spatter on Yathomas Riley's shirt. They demonstrated how the patterns placed him in close proximity at the moment of the fatal shot, within range of the spray that could only have come from pulling the trigger. The medical examiner followed with detailed testimony on the autopsy. The downward trajectory of the bullet, entering Lisa Riley's forehead and exiting behind her left ear, was presented as nearly impossible for a self-inflicted wound. The absence of stippling or soot reinforced the argument. This was not suicide, the expert said. It was homicide. Prosecutors also highlighted the ADT security system records. Jurors saw logs showing that Yathomas accessed the system repeatedly after leaving the house that night, almost obsessively. He had logged in to check sensors and settings, actions that prosecutors argued were an effort to manage the scene from afar, to see if law enforcement or neighbors had noticed anything unusual. One of the logs showed the glass break sensor in the master bedroom was triggered, consistent with the commotion around the time of the shooting. These digital breadcrumbs painted a picture of a man monitoring his crime rather than a husband mourning a sudden loss. The cruelty to children charge was not overlooked. The jury heard about how the infant son, dressed only in a diaper, had been left alone in the bedroom where his mother's body lay in rigor mortis. Photographs from the scene showed baby clothes splattered with blood, while the child himself remained clean. The prosecutor described it as one of the most haunting images of the case. A baby standing beside the lifeless body of his mother, abandoned to spend the night in silence. This detail underscored not just violence, but a level of disregard that added another dimension to the charges. The defense countered as best they could. They argued that Lisa Riley could have taken her own life, pointing to stressors from her demanding work in the emergency room. They reminded jurors that the gun was found near her body, a fact that might support suicide. They pressed experts on the difficulty of determining exact angles of bullet trajectories and argued that the forensic evidence was not absolute. Their strategy was not to convince the jury of an alternate story, but to plant enough doubt that conviction would seem uncertain. Through it all, Yathomas Riley maintained his claim of innocence. He told his version, that his wife had shot herself, that he had not pulled the trigger, and that the events were not what prosecutors described. But his words clashed with the physical evidence, the prior assault, and the digital records that told a story of control and cover-up. After days of testimony, closing arguments crystallized the two sides. The prosecution presented the narrative of a violent husband who escalated from threats to murder, leaving behind a trail of evidence too strong to ignore. The defense asked the jury to consider the possibility of suicide, to resist what they framed as the state's assumptions. The jurors deliberated with the weight of Lisa Riley's life and the future of her husband in their hands. The verdict came in June 2016. The jury found Yathomas Riley guilty on all counts: malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, and cruelty to children. On July 1, 2016, he was sentenced. The court imposed life in prison without the possibility of parole for the malice murder charge. On top of that, he received an additional 20 years for aggravated assault and another 20 years for cruelty to children. The sentences were structured both concurrently and consecutively, ensuring that he would never walk free again. For Lisa's family and colleagues, the verdict brought some measure of justice, though no sentence could erase the loss of a daughter, a doctor, and a mother. The courtroom, packed with observers, reflected both grief and relief. The story had captivated not only Leesburg, but much of Georgia. It was a stark example of domestic violence ending in murder, a cautionary tale about how quickly abuse can escalate. For those who knew Lisa Riley, the verdict was a confirmation of what they had feared from the beginning, that she had been killed, not by her own hand, but by the man who vowed to protect her. But the story did not end with the conviction. Yathomas Riley, unwilling to accept the jury's decision, turned to appeals. Representing himself at times, he filed motions challenging the fairness of his trial. He argued that the lead investigator should not have been allowed to remain in the courtroom, that false evidence had been presented regarding the security system, and that his legal representation had been inadequate. He pushed his claims through the appeals process, maintaining his innocence and alleging procedural errors. Years later, in March 2025, the Georgia Supreme Court issued its ruling. The justices reviewed the claims carefully, but ultimately rejected them all. They upheld his conviction and his life sentence, declaring that the trial had been fair and that the evidence against him remained overwhelming. The court's decision closed the final legal chapter of the case, affirming that Yathomas Riley would spend the rest of his life in prison. For the community, the appeals process was another painful reminder of the tragedy. Yet it also reinforced the strength of the evidence and the correctness of the jury's original verdict. The conviction stood, and so did the memory of Lisa Riley as a mother, a doctor, and a woman whose life was cut short by the very person who should have cherished her. In reflecting on the case, one theme stood out above all: the escalation of domestic violence. The June 14th incident, where Lisa bravely called 911 to report her husband's threats, had been the turning point. It was the warning sign that showed the level of danger in her home. Just weeks later, that warning became reality. The progression from assault to murder was swift and devastating, underscoring the lethal potential of unchecked domestic abuse. The story of Yathomas and Lisa Riley is remembered not only for its tragedy, but also for its lessons. It highlights the importance of taking domestic violence seriously, of recognizing the signs, and of intervening before it is too late. For those who knew Lisa, it remains a story of loss. For those who study cases like this, it is a sobering reminder of the stakes involved when violence enters the home. The final chapter of the case left no ambiguity. Yathomas Riley, once a boxer with a promising career, will live out his days behind prison walls. Lisa Riley, once a physician dedicated to saving lives, was buried too young. Their infant son, who lived through the night beside his mother's body, grew up without her care. And the town of Leesburg, Georgia, carries the memory of a case that revealed the darkest side of human relationships. In the end, the tragedy of July 2015 was sealed not by speculation, but by evidence, not by rumor, but by fact. A jury, a court, and finally a state's highest judges confirmed what investigators had seen from the very beginning. It was not suicide. It was murder.